Hello, everyone. I'm Sandra Bargman, and welcome back to The Edge of Every Day, now at MaximizeU.life and streaming on your favorite podcast platforms. Are you a change maker? Do you walk between worlds, between cultures, between systems? If you answered yes to any of these questions, The Edge of Every Day is the place for you. In a nutshell, this podcast is about pushing boundaries and exploring rough edges. Through conversations and shared stories with friends and colleagues, it's my hope that we can begin to understand our edges. And what I mean by edges is those places where we are fearful, those places where we are resistant to change, those places where paradox and contradicting identities live in our beliefs and in our understandings, both individually and collectively. We live in edgy, challenging times, and we cannot keep looking away from the ugly, from the difficult, and silence is no longer an option. Life isn't black or white, it's both. And I want to talk about that. I want to face the tension of paradox. And I want to engage in the hard conversations. I want to explore the rough edges between our light-filled brilliance and our dark, shadowy corners. Because the more we recognize our own edges and get real about them, the more we can help others to do the same. And that, I fully believe, can help to change the world. So, thanks again for tuning in. I got to tell you, folks, hosting this podcast, having these compelling and insightful conversations has been one of the greatest accomplishments and one of the greatest gifts of my life. As you know, if you are a loyal listener, I never have enough time with my guests. I always want more time. I have more questions. It's always a fine line for me between unpacking a topic more deeply or moving on to another bit of information so listeners can get a more expanded introduction to my guests. On occasion, I've brought a guest back for a follow-up conversation, and today's episode is just that. Today, we are live in the hive with our special guest, Kay Louise Aldred, for a follow-up conversation, part 2 of our episode from a couple months ago. There is not a normal human, Somatic Shamanism and Neurodiversity. You can catch that episode, number 26, on all your favorite podcast platforms and at MaximizeU.life. I absolutely loved that conversation. We spoke about Kay's book, Somatic Shamanism and Embodied Spirituality, her spiritual journey that led to this wisdom, neurodiversity, and her late life diagnosis of autism, creating safe and intentional spaces. And we had a great laugh over our childhood experience of the theater of church, or shall we say, the Church of Theater. Ever since I discovered her, I have been quite taken with Kay's experience and teachings of embodied spirituality, and in particular, her understanding of the relationship of the nervous system and the healing of trauma to our experience ourselves as divinity, divinity that is our birthright. In these challenging times of spiritual disconnect, collapse, culture, and climate crisis, and the growing mental health issues as a result of all of those challenges, I feel there is no more important work than what Kay is teaching, modeling, and embodying. So without further ado, it is time to introduce our guest. Kay Louise Aldred is a visionary change maker, a teacher, liberation, embodiment, and spirituality-oriented theologian, writer, and published author. She catalyzes individual, institutional, and collective evolution and well-being through education, embodiment, and creative meaning-making strategies via interconnected insights and approaches which combine metacognition, intuition, and instinct. As a trauma-informed mentor and facilitator, Kay offers online and in-person consultancy, training, and resources. She's a prolific writer and is the author of Somatic Shamanism, Your Fleshy Knowing as the Tree of Life, Making Love with the Divine, Sacred, Ecstatic, and Erotic Experiences, Mentorship with Goddess, Growing Sacred Womanhood, and Embodied Education, Creating Safe Space for Learning, Facilitating, and Sharing. All published through Girl God Books. Kay is autistic and passionate about increasing awareness of the strengths of neurodivergence. She is newly named the development lead at Neurodiverse Connection, a neurodivergent-led community interest company set up to improve support and outcomes for neurodivergent populations. Welcome, Kay.
Thank you, Sandra. I'm delighted to be here.
I'm so
Yeah,
thrilled.
love it.
Oh, I'm so thrilled to have you back, Kay. It's good to see you in the new year. Ooh.
Yeah,
And yeah. Did you have a good new year? Good holiday?
I did. Thank you. Yes, we just had quite a considerable snowfall, which is just thawing today. So yeah, it's been uncharacteristically cold for this time of year.
Oh,
But yeah, we had a great break. Thank you.
well, yeah, it's pretty frigid here in New York State. I'm presently upstate, but I just spent the week in New York City and my face froze off. Ah, probably what caused my cold that I'm on the end of now, folks. So if you hear me coughing, you'll know why. So, as you know, as I mentioned, I've had Kay on the show a few months ago, and I always like to share, just in the event that somebody hasn't heard or won't hear that first interview, although I highly recommend it. I'm going to let people know, as I like to that how I know my guests. I know Kay through a mutual colleague and friend, Dr. Lynn Sedgmore, who Kay knows and works with, and whom I've had the pleasure of having on the Edge of Everyday podcast, not once but twice. And I've asked you both of my favorite questions that I ask all of my guests already, but since it was enough time that maybe there might be a different answer, I'll just ask you one. What identity do you lead with? You never know. That's why we love this question. It morphs.
It certainly has. And I actually forgot you asked me that. What identity do I lead with? I think today it would be educator,
Mm,
actually. I think that's the one that feels right because maybe because as you said, I'm moving back into more of an education role and a front-facing role. Um, but education with the purpose of evolution
mm.
and expansion rather than kind of knowledge over or knowledge to education as in to expand and evolve and support the individual to do that themselves. So perhaps not how we traditionally would perceive educator. That feels good today.
How beautifully stated, and so perfect for today because that's is always the flow, and I'm sure that's most often the flow with you in any kind of situation like this, but in particular, helping people through a process, through your personal journey, I'm hoping will be the focus of today's episode. So thank you for that beautiful understanding of educator. So in your intro, you talk about metacognition, and I went in for the other interview and read about that, and then forgot to ask you about it in the last interview, and I wanted you to expand on that before we dove in. What is metacognition? Please elaborate.
So if you look online, you'll get a variety of definitions, which I wasn't even familiar with the word. I thought I'd actually made it up when I thought about it.
I'm claiming it as my own.
But it isn't. There's lots of research out there. But metacognition for me is meta, being able to look in and observe beyond cognition, but being able to observe how we think, what we think, why we think it, um, and being really curious around the way we process the brain and the thoughts that we have. So for me, it's thinking about our thinking.
I love that. Thinking about our thinking and the many ways in which we do that. Yeah. What comes up for me is and it's not even the brain, it's not even thinking. Intuition is thinking, it's heart-based, it's gut-based, it's all of those things. But yeah, being the big overall witness. I love it. Lovely. So, okay. In our last conversation, I shared with everyone, and I have it here again. I'm putting up the beautiful somatic shamanism that I am working with. It's what first drew me into Kay's work was this, and particularly because it felt intuitively correct for me to, as I see myself shamanistically, and also because it somehow felt relevant and prescient to the writing of my play, and it has turned out to be exactly that. So that's pretty exciting. Um, and hearing the word shaman, we talked briefly about that in our last episode, and I came across this in that I had to read to you because we talked about the appropriation of that word, shamanism, and you gave something so beautiful and weaving it into my writing. I came across this because, this academic understanding of the word shaman versus sort of the spiritual bypassing and the the sort of the bubblegum understanding of the word shaman and priestess, and I'm a priestess that in some communities. But I thought I wanted to read this for you because it was so spot on. It's from Stephen Wolfe. These days, someone seems to have a definition and interpretation of the term shamanism, from the structural anthropologists to the mythologists, to the Jungians, the Freudians, the transpersonal psychotherapists, the process-oriented psychologists, to the New Agers with their psychobabble. The academics hold to a strict, rigid definition, feeling they have proprietary rights to the term and smirking at everyone else. On the other hand, New Agers have a definition so broad as to be meaningless, and as you so wisely said, spiritual bypassing. Both sides miss the profound depth and breadth of this particular spiritual way, which is much more than mere technique. Shamanism may possibly be the oldest spiritual path and consequently has far more profound implications for contemporary humans than its academic interpreters realize. The reason for this is that the act of interpretation is a mental exercise, whereas shamanism is a living dynamic that involves all of the senses, which is what you speak about so eloquently, all of your work so extraordinarily. A sensuous experience that must be known in a primary and primal way. The mental wheel spinning of academics or the shallow genuflecting of New Age entrepreneurs will never truly comprehend it until they stop interpreting and start experiencing it internally and externally with mind, emotion, body, and spirit. That is you. Completely could have said every single, yes, could have said every single one of those words. I was like, yes, I have to read that to her.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
It's just so spot on. And, and as I shared with my own company and understanding myself as a shaman, shaman-like. I've thought hard about what you said. I would never call myself a shaman. I've thought long and hard about that phrase. But that just leads us into what I want to focus on today. And I've started, Kay has been glorious in sharing Making Love with the Divine, one of her other books, that we only touched upon in our last conversation. And I've gotten through 4 chapters. I decided to stop because I felt like I really wanted to do it with someone. So I stopped myself. But it goes into greater depth and expansion of the understanding of the nervous system as our divine communication center. And I mean, this is the mind exploding understanding that I grasped onto because I was not someone prior to focusing in on your work that really looked at the nervous system and understood it in a way, its relationship to spirituality. And I understand embodied spirituality. So, tell us, it, expand a little on making love with the divine, and how the concept of, and I have some quotes here from the book, but I don't want to read any more quotes. I want to hear it from you. The understanding of the nervous system and healing trauma, and how that is the divine sacred center of our divinity in human form.
Absolutely. And this is so perfectly aligned with where I am, because when Making Love with the Divine was published, so it's not quite 2 years ago,
Mm.
the taboo response was phenomenal to it. And I think I wrote it, I published it perhaps at a time where even people who were my allies, or I felt were on the journey in the past of me, were ready to kind of embrace and be part of, and they weren't, but they are now. And so Making Love with the Divine is really a culmination of my personal journey. It is a direct polemic, or speaking back to the academic theology which I was immersed in, and also is a direct kind of antidote. Again, I call it to Genesis, as is interpreted through the Christian current Christian church. So it's a culmination, and I mean, at the moment, you might meet me again in a decade and I've discovered or experienced something else. But it's a repatterning of myself in Eve, and a retelling of Eve's story through my lived experience, but because it's like, oh, that's what Eve did, but then it was made wrong. She ate the apple, as in she consumed the apple, the redness of her flesh, as I see it, and made love with the divine through her embodiment, which I did, and I've came into relationship with Eve in a different way through that. And so the divine, so that's kind of like the book, but the divine nervous system, which is the first chapter, was really born out of my coming out of functional freeze that I'd been in so long, which is fight flight energies, and kind of peak to such a state that you go into this freeze response and you live well. And coming out of that, as I discharged dysregulation out of my body, and also healed, started to release trauma, and came into relationship with my nervous system and the flow of parasympathetic and sympathetic activation, I realized that through that movement, I was embodying the stories of the Bible and of the divine, of God, Goddess, and it was like, oh, it's all in my body. The burning bush is in my body, and so
Mm.
is the still small voice of calm. And I mean, I'm using biblical narrative here because that's what I was brought up with, but it
Right.
suddenly became the lived experience, which the mystics talk about, and some excellent spiritual Christian writers still talk about, but isn't found in the theatre of the church, which I know there is what you wanted to
Yes, we're going to touch on that too.
Wanted to
But
go to.
oh
I
my
hope
gosh,
that gives you a
oh,
summary.
completely. But for those who are just listening, Kay was breathing in and out and sort of this, and just for our listeners, just in case somebody's tuning in for the not really focused in and knowledgeable about the nervous system, parasympathetic and sympathetic systems, and how you have woven them like feminine energy and masculine energy.
Yes, and we're being taught in the Renaissance of the New Age that the feminine is all about kind of like the parasympathetic, the rest and digest, the nurture. The feminine also has the sympathetic, which is the fight, flight, the fire, the warrioress. In the same way as the masculine that we're taught is the sympathetic activation, the fight, flight, also has parasympathetic,
Mm.
you know, again is in that stable mountain protector energy, which the non-verbal that you will have. So we have these weaving of what have been gendered energetics in the nervous system, which for me become eventually, I say in a quote, a non-gendered symbiosis symphony of ecstatic experience, which is the weaving of beyond gender and divinity into an energetic flow, which is the divine, of which all the different phases and facets are our expression, our embodied experience of our nervous system. It's all with it. For me, it's all now within me. It's not external. I can receive inspiration and prompts in beautiful writing and in scriptures, and oh, I love it. But it's alive. It's like organic. The divine is organic.
Yes. Oh, that brings tears to my eyes. It's so exquisite and so what we need. And this is why I had to have Kay back to talk about the journey that she took to getting to this experience, to feeling it within and being able to teach others and explain it in a way that opens up the door for everyone to see that they can take this journey too. They can connect to that within. Because that's where we are, people. That's the disc. In my opinion, as I was telling Kay in our pre-chat, that's the disconnect, and that's put us in the hot water here on planet Earth that we find ourselves in. That we have handed over the power. We've handed over our divine birthright.
Absolutely.
So, so let's go back. Let's go back to your grandmother. That moment where I burst out laughing, and your grandmother, the theater of the church, and erotic innocence. I loved that. So tell us the story of you as a young person and your grandmother and your discovery of all these things and your experience, I should say, of all these things.
I will, and I do remember this really, you know, such a heartwarming way to retell the story. Um, so this is my paternal grandmother, and she was not a grandmother as you would, you know, like a cookies and a hot fire and a hot water bottle and a rock you and hug you up. She wasn't like that. She was what you would class as eccentric. I mean, looking back, clearly neurodivergent in her own way, obsessed with her special interest was religion. Um, and and also The King and I, the musicals. She danced and but I would never get a hot meal. Her favorite thing to give me for lunch was lettuce dipped in sugar and things like that. You know, she was a completely eccentric. But I used to go and you know, during the school holidays, or before I was even at school, with her. She was the church verger, which means she kind of cleaned the church and opened the church, and thought nothing of taking me to funerals. And I was so small that I would be standing under the pew. So if you imagine how big where the hymn books go, I could hide in there and watch. I watched the theatre of the church in funerals, and from being 3, you know, it's that early, and it was a high Anglican church, so there was incense and a lot of theatre,
A lot of
and I was
costuming.
and costuming, and I was witnessing grief from a very early age, which was such an important lesson for me in my
Mhm.
shamanic journey, because
Mhm.
that death was surrounded me from being young, through that accompanying my grandmother. So she introduced me to the theatre of the church, the enactment, the acting, the positing of the leader and what it meant to be or in my generational upbringing, to be a spiritual leader. And intersected that with the raw grief meant that I had a very embodied experience in this theatre of the church, alongside a completely eccentric feminine archetype. Um, so I remember her fondly, and I also see the impact that the shame aspect of the church had on her. It really tied her mind in knots. And so when I liberated myself from that, I really feel like I liberated her. I feel her presence, her joy, her um, the ancestral. This is what you were searching for, and it was there in your dancing and in your movement and in your eccentricity, and may that so that it ripples back to her through the realms.
Amen. I feel that for her. That's so exquisite. Yes, the ancestors. So many of us women in today's world are feeling our lineage of the women, of the men too, but more poignantly the women, at least for me, their liberation. That's beautiful. And I'm so excited that you were, I mean, excited, that's not the right word. I'm maybe even envious is the right word that you were allowed to be. I desperately wanted to go to the funerals of people, and when I was a little kid and I wasn't allowed because I was so sensitive. Oh, that she was. Meanwhile, as an adult, it was so soul crushing that I couldn't go, that I couldn't see the body because I was seeing the energy, and and my mother years later going, well, we didn't know that, we thought you were too sensitive. We didn't know you would be the kind of person that would really be fine with it. And I said, yeah, I get that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I wasn't allowed to go to her funeral. So that was my
Wow.
so this is young Kay. And then I went to school, and then I was disconnected, I suppose, from my grandmother and that insight into the church, and brought up in a very, my mother was a scientist and an atheist. And my dad kind of did his church thing on his own time. But when my grandmother died, my dad's grief was so intense, they didn't let me go to her funeral because they thought it was inappropriate, because I would have been too sensitive. Or
Right.
I think my father didn't want me to see him in that level of grief. So they didn't know I had all that life.
Yeah.
So
And your character had room for it.
yeah.
And maybe not everyone at that age does, or even at any age,
Mm,
but you did.
mm.
Hmm. How did you feel about not being able to go?
I was angry
Yeah.
at the time, but obviously I had enough insight, because I was early teens, I think, to kind of understand that it was my dad. I felt it was okay because I'd had that request from my father, so I honored it.
Mm.
But it didn't make any sense to me because I was old enough to go, you know.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Well, there's a lot of questions in there, but I want to keep moving due
Yes.
to time. So yes, your dad. So then, when did you decide? I know you moved into all things religious and part of your church, and you went to seminary. And you said on the last episode that you popped out of the womb with a spiritual understanding in your antenna, and huge curiosity about the spiritual journey. So, what got you to the church and seminary? I mean,
So
obviously your family, but seminary is a whole different ballgame.
yeah, the kind of pursuing the ordination process came later in my life, but certainly religion, obviously my grandmother was the foundational part of that religious, not spiritual, religious journey. And then I was in the church and became a head chorister, so it's late 10 up through teenage years, and then hit teenage years and moved into academic study of religion and theology, and did a degree in theology. And then when I graduated, so I'm 21, the decision was, do I then go forward for ordination at that point? And I felt 21 was a bit young, so I trained to be a teacher and taught religious education in school. Then I had children. Then I went back and did an MA in theology after my third child was born. And at that point, I felt, again, I wasn't quite ready. And the pursuing ordination happened after a lot of trauma and like difficult life experience.
Can you share anything about that?
Yeah, a divorce.
Mm.
Like both of my parents died when they were young. Chronic
Oh.
illness. And then remembering difficult trauma from my childhood, so abusive situations as well. And so it was like, then I had an opening, and I was like, right, now I feel like I'm ready to go forward into ordination. So at this point, I'm kind of in my early 40s actually, and um, and then secretly at the same time as going forward for ordination training, I was also, I can say this now, I was also training shamanically. So I
I
was
love
taking
this. I'm like secretly. Ooh.
secretly, I can say this now. It's like I was testing two paths simultaneously. Um, and yeah, I was booted off ordination training at the discernment stage because I was, well, there was a lot of reasons, but one of them was I was a divorcee, and the second one was that I didn't meet the criteria for discernment of calling because I hadn't fallen to my knees and like had that typical, yeah, like, you know,
Bow down to the patriarchal system of religion.
yes, I didn't meet that. I was like, no, it's within me. It comes in and out and through me, the spiritual calling. And they just didn't have that language system. And but
Oh,
I
what a
really believed I
heretic you
had,
were.
well,
Love
the
it.
I have written about the ordination kind of interviewer who came to the house and asked very inappropriate questions, like about my daughters, whether she had boyfriends. They didn't ask about the teenage sons. Oh, it was horrific. I've written about it.
Oh my Lord.
Yeah, yeah. Um,
So you turned your back on it.
well, I was booted out, and it was the best thing that could have happened because there was no way I was going to let go of that.
Yeah.
It was so kind of connected me, what I thought, to my lineage and my ancestry, and I was conditioned in the patriarchal church.
Yeah.
But my body was moving with shamanic
Yes.
medicine, and so I was, my body was there, but my mind couldn't let go of the system.
Mm,
So when
mm,
that cut the cord of and I woke to the oppression of women within the church at such a deep
mm.
level through that experience and the conditioning.
Yeah. I have to say, I so respect that you continue to weave your theology throughout all of your shamanistic understanding. That's really, I do too. Whenever I write or I'm probably less connected. No, not probably. Most definitely less connected to my religious trainings, but than you. But I still see and the extraordinary value and how it can be potentially expansive for other people. And it is a part of us. And there is a connection to the mystical side of the early Christian movement that's really wrapped in with the goddess tradition. And yeah, I really love that. So you got booted. How did that feel? You were probably, well, I'm assuming you were really pissed off.
I asked for a reason why. I wrote to the bishop. I never ever got a response. I took it as far as I could in terms of, well, for what reason, on what basis? I've got a first class honours degree in theology. Come on, I'm a
Yeah.
teacher. I'm pastoral. I'm trained pastorally. But I have since kind of studied, and we're seeing the breaking down of the Church of England at the moment, the Anglican
Ooh,
Church, and it's huge in the news over here at the moment. I don't know whether you've seen it in the US.
I yeah, the what's his name?
Safeguarding,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yoo-hoo.
safeguard.
Yes. Yes,
Um,
pedophilia. Really? Get out of here. Pedophilia in the
it,
church? Get out. I've never, no, I'm obviously being wickedly sarcastic. Just unbelievable. Yeah, it's breaking. I did read about it actually after our last, you mentioned it in our last episode. Wow.
it's quite significant, and
Mm,
I think it, if they'd enrolled people into ordination, like me, we would have probably not lasted into through the second or third round of training, because we would have been asking these questions.
right.
Um,
Inability
and
to deal with the shadow.
yeah, absolutely, and just deal with that basic procedure.
Yeah, like the truth of
Safeguarding.
the situation. Yeah, yoo-hoo.
Yeah.
Safeguarding. Yeah.
So I wouldn't have
Wow.
lasted anyway, but it was the best thing for them to reject me once and for all, and so publicly, because then I could actually properly deconstruct the control aspect of the church over me and differentiate what theology felt embodied, true, and
Mm,
of the Christ energy, which is of love and heart, and what was control, and which theologies are of control, of which the fall and Genesis, and how the narrative of the fall is. It's a that disconnect of the embodied, the shamefulness of embodiment through that story of Genesis is at the root of every
everything.
problem that we have.
Say that again. Please say that again.
I'll try to. The Genesis and the disconnect of divinity from the body, not even sex here, the bodily needs, is at the root of ecocide, genocide, the logical supremacy of the mind over embodied gnosis and knowledge. It's just the problem.
Amen. Bam. Mic drop. Yeah, it is. Um, so, just how did you discover looking at time? Wanting to unpack more of that, but looking at time onward on your journey, how did you connect with, um, the energy work and shamanism while you were doing all of this? What was that story? How did you kind of bump into that?
That was to try and recover from chronic illness and
Ah, of course,
trauma.
yeah.
So I was doing trauma work, I was doing nervous system work, good quality nervous system work. Iron Lion, yes, my
Yes.
mentor, and teacher, and also exploring spirituality from an energetic perspective and journeying in traditional shamanic journeying, which was very much up and out and through consciousness only. So I trained that way, 4 winds, and then came down and in and through the body, which is somatic
Yeah.
shamanism, which is then marries the nervous system work and the shamanism work, and that's where I became. But it's what for me is the true story of resurrection. It's like coming alive again from being functionally frozen and dead to self, to mind only dominance. And it was like because I retell the Easter story in that way, and then I came alive in my whole self. And so theological language is very useful. That story, the stories are useful from an embodied
Mm,
perspective. um and making love with the divine was part of my journey of kind of deconstructing faith and finding
mm,
faith and finding other women and going, hang on, we don't need a church, we don't need to buy anything. In our mundane lived experience of just being human is the true wealth of our spirituality, because I believe it should be accessible for everyone. I don't believe that anybody should have to pay for their spirituality. I think it's our birthright.
mm.
And that's why I drew on the voices of other women and sent out questionnaires and found out about what women's lived experience was of their spirituality, even people who did not class themselves as spiritual or religious. So how are you finding? I use other words. I use other
Yeah.
words to make it more accessible.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, exactly. You don't even have to believe. You can be an atheist and want to be more alive in the world, more alive in your body, more alive in your life, more turned on with your senses. Yeah. No, I mean, this is it. The you said I want to uncouple spirituality. I loved this. Uncouple spirituality from capitalism and consumerism, which I just love the phrasing of that because, the new age in the spiritual bypassing community, it's all about capitalism and consumerism and these blissful moments and oh, and I'm a priestess and
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Wow. Okay, for our last bit of time, I'd like to um, talk about a neurodiverse connection, the neurodiverse population in terms of spirituality. You said in a quote from our last episode, you said this: "We are searching for an alternative world within this one."
Mm.
It was so powerful, brought tears to my eyes when I re-listened because I
Mm.
didn't remember hearing you say that in the moment. Isn't that interesting? Spiritual abuse in the community. And this goes hand in hand with the understanding of handing over your spiritual power, forgetting that it's within you, handing it over to the church, to your guru, to your self-help mentor, which is not to say you shouldn't be mentored and taught by and be turned on by that. But there's abuse and manipulation, and in particular with this community that I want to bring to light, not only for neurodiverse people, but for everyone.
Mm.
So you talked about what is spiritual abuse? What might neurodivergent individuals be more at risk of spiritual abuse? And what is predatory behavior? Can you
Mm.
elaborate just a bit on that and how all of us might pay closer attention and stop being plugging into the hierarchy and the manipulation of this sort of abuse?
Yeah, so oh gosh, it's such a
I
huge
know it's a
topic.
huge
Okay,
question.
if I
I
keep
know.
it
I
keep it
apologize. I did it at the very end. If you know what, if we go a little over, so what?
okay, so safeguarding is a collective responsibility. It's everyone's responsibility.
Mm,
It is still a hypothesis because as yet, of course, there isn't a PhD done in this, but I believe that the neurodivergent population, so everybody's neurodiverse, neurotypical and neurodivergent. The neurodivergent population, neurodivergent are people whose neurotype or body-mind way of being does not benefit for the predominant neuronormative ways that we are structured in capitalist consumerist society, etc. Um, we, I believe, make up a big proportion of spiritual seekers, both in and religious people, because so either within religion or within non-mainstream spirituality or pop spirituality, I see what I believe is a high proportion of the neurodivergent population in those
mm,
groups. And within those groups, both within religion and in mainstream spiritual groups, there is abuse going on, which we are
mm,
seeing documented, and it's unfolding all of the time. So we see that within the mainstream religions. I can only speak to Anglican because I'm that's my religious upbringing. I don't want to speak to other religions, but I can speak to that, and we're seeing that happen now. And I can also see it happening in breathwork classes, ashrams, retreat
mhm,
centres, wellness centres. Neurodivergent population, we know, are proportionately more likely to be victims of interpersonal violence. That means violence or abuse by someone that they have an interpersonal relationship with, whether that's an intimate relationship or a friendship. And because we often might not feel like we fit in this world, we are seeking realities and ways of being in community that isn't of the mainstream, and religion and spiritual communities can offer that. So we are, unfortunately, the prey, and predators move in these circles. Predators move in these circles.
Oh my Lord, don't they?
So I'm here to spotlight and highlight, and have produced a resource on that for Neurodiverse Connection. The fact that safeguarding is the responsibility of everyone, and that all of these venues, religion and wellness and spiritual venues, should be regulated and should have policy and procedure and be inspected, because it's the only way that we're going to start to kind of get a handle on what's actually going on. And they're not.
No, they're not.
They're not regulated spaces.
No, no, and it really is, I've sassily on occasion, it can be the island of misfit toys, the spiritual communities. That's what I laugh and I say that. And I say that about the theater community too. So, of which I'm also part of all of those. So I'm one of them too. So I can crack that joke. But it does speak to the open door of, I mean, please, here in the United States, the evangelical movement and the pedophilia and the physical abuse, and the sex trafficking of pastors is, I mean, 3 times a day you're reading about breaking news of somebody who's been found out and sentenced. Yeah.
And to speak
Go ahead.
to what spiritual abuse is, the misuse of scripture
Mm.
or ideology, to control, coerce, diminish, shame, belittle, control. It's control, really, an individual. And that also can happen outside of religious and spiritual circles, because you can put the fear of God, so to speak, on into anybody. And that's starting to be more researched and defined. There's an amazing writer, Lisa Oakley, over here in the UK, who is writing more about that term. But we're going to see it, Sandra, mark my words, this unpacking in the next 5 years, I think, of what's of spiritual, as spirituality rises and we become more in touch with our spirituality, and in this fabled Aquarian age, which is really important, we also need to get to grips with how that can be used abusively, because
The shadow.
is always there. So we're going to see this being unpacked, I think.
I would agree.
Yeah.
And that's why I really wanted to focus on this with you as part of the unpacking process that everyone can go through just for themselves.
Yeah.
Oh, my Kay, thank you. Thank you so, so much for sharing your journey. Wow. What to say to top that? I mean, that's, is there one last bow that you want to put on to all of that for our listeners before we sign off?
The making of the divine is about liberation, and it's about, it's a bit of a bold statement that I say I'm liberating the divine from abuse, but I really do believe that that is part of what the book is doing. I'm liberating our bodies,
Yes.
from to be able to not see pleasure as sinful. I'm not doing it, actually. The women that I spoke to, whose stories I tell, did this for me. I am not doing anything. So it's actually about liberation, and realizing that, to go back to what you said at the beginning, it is our birthright to be to realize our innate spirituality is within us, and our route to what that means for us is within us. And there's no right way. It's like there's no right way to be human, there's no right way to be spiritual. So let's wrap the two episodes together, if that's okay.
Exactly. Most definitely. The joy of life, the aliveness. Yeah. Oh, I can't thank you enough for coming on again and sharing this journey and giving us a template of your journey specifically. So now hearing it, folks, run, don't walk, to go buy the book, and you can Making Love with the Divine. Fabulous title, people. Fabulous, provocative, glorious title. You can go to Kay's website, Kay Louise Aldred. It'll be in the show notes, ALDRED.com. Kay is at LinkedIn as well. You're on Instagram. And you're not on Blue Sky yet.
Not yet.
You haven't made that move. It's kind of a fun, it's kind of where I'm going to end up, I think. It's a good platform. It's not manipulated, at least not yet. But you can find her there. Making Love with the Divine by Kay Louise Aldred. Thank you again, dear Kay, for being on the Edge of Everyday podcast.
Thank you, Sandra.
And listeners, remember, as Kay says, we are the tree of life. Our path is not up and out, but in and through. Remember, you are always at the edge of the miraculous. Until we speak again, take good care.